I tell you what, let's switch gears and pimp this important book, Aiming for Liberty. This is your 12th book?
Yes.
My God, has anybody read all 12 other than you?
No, I think between my wife and my parents, probably all 12 have been read by at least one person.
Okay. And the print run has been more than like 3 copies per book, right?
Yeah, this is a pretty big print run. I think it's about 12,000.
All right. On Aiming for Liberty, you talk about a lot of different things, including just the right to self-defense. Let me just bring out a couple ones. Did you know for fact that if you have a gun in your house, you are 43 times more likely to shoot an innocent person than a bad guy? It's a fact.
And in fact, it is the all-time favorite fact of the gun prohibition folks. And there's a chapter in that book that talks exactly about that and why that's sort of so misleading and fallacious. For one thing, it's a statistic that's garnered. It equates the people who are likely to misuse guns. You know, violent alcoholics, people who are mentally ill, people who have criminal convictions. The overwhelming majority of the gun misuse comes from them. So to say that those people are comparable to a law-abiding good citizen with a gun and that there's the same risk is really inaccurate. The second thing is the way it measures anti-crime efficiency. You know, could you imagine if you said, well, last year the Denver Police Department killed 12 people and this year they've only killed 8. What's going wrong with our police department? They're 33% less effective. You don't go around measuring anti-crime work by how many dead bodies there are at the end of the day. You look at how many lives are saved, how many crimes are prevented. We know that the vast majority, 98% or more, of defensive gun uses certainly do not end in any kind of fatality. And we also know from a study by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, which is not exactly one of the top pro-gun organizations in this country, that guns are used defensively against burglars in the United States in home invasions about 500,000 times a year. Again, the vast majority, no shots even fired.
The trigger isn't pulled. That a homeowner with a gun in his hand or in her hand is a whole lot more able to protect herself than just a phone to 911.
Well, and that's what the Centers for Disease Control found is in the vast majority of cases where there was a confrontation between the victim who had armed herself with a gun and the burglar. The burglar decided that it was time to leave work early, and that was the end of the story.
Let's get to some of the issues you take on here, including discrimination. Now, I never thought gun laws were about discrimination. In this book, you make a case that really the basis of gun laws were discrimination.
Well, certainly, historically, that's true. The first gun law in the United States was enacted in Virginia around 1619 to prevent free blacks from owning guns. And that's been was certainly the history of gun control throughout the 19th century. You know, after the Civil War, once Congress passed the 14th Amendment, and one part that did get enforced at least from time to time, was the requirement for equal protection of the laws. So states couldn't make laws that overtly discriminated against blacks, at least on gun possession. So what the southern states...
But before that, you're telling me that many of these gun laws were directed at blacks.
Oh, absolutely. And that was one of the first things the southern states did after the Civil War, before Reconstruction had gotten going, and really the white governments were still in power. They passed things like Mississippi and other states had the black codes, which said that, for example, a black couldn't own a gun without permission from the government. And of course, permission wouldn't be given. Some of the southern state armies that were returning home would go house to house and confiscate guns from all the blacks. And what Congress found repeatedly was that this gun confiscation was the key initial step in setting up the reign of terror of organizations like the Ku Klux Klan, because they would first disarm the victims, and then they'd really be able to get the oppression and the terror going against the defenseless victims.
What happens after the 14th Amendment is passed, where it says you can't do that? There's equal protection under the law. So therefore, if you're going to have a gun law, it's going to apply to everyone. How can gun laws be discriminatory if that's the case?
Well, for example, you can pass laws that say you can't have a gun without a license, and then if you're a white guy, nobody cares about whether you have a license. And if you're a black guy, they don't give you the license. And that there was a case called Watson versus Stone in Florida in 1940, where a judge wrote a concurring opinion which said everybody knows that this Florida gun licensing law was enacted for the sole purpose of disarming the blacks and has never been used for any other purpose. And you can also pass laws, and we still see some of these today, to try to make guns too expensive for poor people to own. So Tennessee had something that was passed in 1870 that was ostensibly a gun safety law.
1870?
1870. Not a true gun safety law, but one that said nobody can have handguns except for the Army and Navy model guns. Well, and the Army and Navy model guns were, of course, very high-quality guns, typically owned by Confederate soldiers who brought their guns home from the war. And so they could keep their guns, but it meant that the less expensive guns that, say, a freedman who was just working as a sharecropper and barely had any money, of course, because he'd been a slave and hadn't had a chance to save any money because his master had taken all the wealth that he should have earned through his own labor, didn't have the money to buy such an expensive gun, and then you outlawed the inexpensive ones.
Isn't there a modern equivalent to that law as well? Don't we call them Saturday night specials, that these are cheap guns and therefore we need to get them off the streets because they're just bought for crime?
Exactly, and of course Saturday night special is itself a derivative of a racist phrase, which I won't repeat here. And it's very much at that same kind of purpose. They're also sometimes called ghetto guns. And one of the ways you know that this is not really about gun safety, about, supposedly these guns, they're also called junk guns, these don't work, they'll blow up in your hand, we're just trying to protect people from having guns that nobody would want to have, is all these laws, like the one they have in California currently on this, allow police to possess these guns. Now, why would you want police to have bad guns? Of course you wouldn't. So you think that would be the first thing you'd do, is protect the police from having these guns that supposedly don't even work. And in fact, we know a lot of police officers like these guns because many of them are pretty small and compact, and so they're frequently worn on an ankle holster as a backup gun. If your regular large gun on your belt holster malfunctions or there's some problem with it, you've got a second gun as a backup on the ankle holster.
Talk to me a little bit about the anti-gun agenda. I mean, there are tactics that anti-gunners use, and they've got emotion on their side. I mean, as you know my history. I used to be an anti-gunner. I used to be a member of Handgun Control. It was a long, slow process of actually my brother Paul, who bought a gun. I thought it was crazy, and we took it apart, and he showed me the internal safeties. He showed me the external safeties. I started doing the research, and including research on your own, and it wasn't too long before I became a gun owner. Now I'm a life member of the NRA. But there's an emotional impact that a gun has, as if it has some sort of magic to it itself, that it's a swastika. It's something religious, not just a bit of machinery. And because of that, I think gun owner or the anti-gun groups are able to do a lot of good bait and switch routines. They're able to grab the emotional high ground. Gun owners don't do that. What is the anti-gun agenda?
Well, historically, it's been to ban as many people from owning as many guns as possible, and you will rarely, among the major national anti-gun groups, just about everything that comes along that fits in that is something they have supported. You have the groups have a little diversity among themselves in what they put at the top of their agenda. But an example of the bait and switch is there was this big national hysteria caused by the anti-gun groups starting in 1989 over so-called assault weapons. And assault's a crime. So by the very making up that false label, they make people think that these guns must necessarily be very powerful, bad guns that are only of use to crime. But then you look at the laws that actually get passed. New Jersey actually outlawed a bunch of air guns, BB guns and pellet guns, and not firearms, things that just use compressed air for power, in its assault weapon ban.